The fluorescent lights hummed above her like caged insects. Rachel Torres pushed the crash cart down the corridor of Mercy General, her movements economical, purposeful, the kind of efficiency that came from muscle memory carved into bone by 2 decades of doing this in places where hesitation cost lives. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the cart's cold stainless steel handle. Service-related tremors, her VA doctor called them. She called them a reminder. She was a temp nurse now. Invisible. That was the arrangement. Houston's heat had followed her inside, clinging to her scrubs like a second skin. The hospital's air conditioning struggled to compete with the August afternoon bleeding through the windows of the East Corridor. She'd been at Mercy General for 3 weeks, long enough to learn the routes between departments, short enough that nobody asked questions about her references or why her credentials file was flagged with a medical restriction notice that said nothing and everything at once. Classified. That's all the form said. The hospital's hiring manager had shrugged. They needed bodies. She needed invisibility. It was a transaction. The supply closet on the 3rd floor was her checkpoint. She restocked the trauma equipment with ritualistic precision, checking chest tubes, verifying the expiration dates on pericardiocentesis kits, arranging medications in order of likelihood. O2 first. Epinephrine second. The rest followed in descending order of critical need. Her fingers moved across the equipment with the steadiness of a surgeon preparing for a high-stakes operation, not a temp nurse stocking supplies in dim fluorescent light. Someone watching closely would have noticed the difference. Someone like Dr. Marcus Sterling would notice and misinterpret it entirely. She had seen him for the first time on her 2nd shift, moving through the hospital like a man accustomed to people stepping aside. Mid-50s, expensive shoes that hadn't seen a scuff mark, a watch that cost more than her monthly rent in Arlington. He wore his authority-like cologne, heavy enough to announce arrival 3 hallways away. He was the kind of doctor who used his title as a battering ram. She'd learned to recognize the type in Kandahar, where rank without competence got people killed. Sterling had the rank. That was becoming obvious. The competence was still in question. The intercom crackled at 3:22 p.m. Incoming trauma. ETA for minutes. Trauma Bay 3, all hands. Rachel didn't rush. She'd learned years ago that rushing telegraphed panic. She secured the final chest tube in its plastic slot, closed the closet door with her hip, and moved toward the stairwell with the kind of calm that came from having already survived worse. Much worse. The memory of Kandahar pressed against the back of her skull like heat lightning, distant, but real. She pushed it down. That Rachel Torres didn't exist anymore. Not here. The emergency department erupted into controlled chaos. Nurses materialized from break rooms. Residents pulled on fresh gloves. The paramedics' radio chatter filled the bays, 47-year-old male, GSW to the left shoulder, responding to commands, vital stable at scene, on-scene time for minutes, transport time 6 minutes. Rachel stationed herself at the supply station adjacent to Trauma Bay 3. This was the part where invisibility became an asset. They didn't ask temp nurses to step into the bays. They used them to anticipate needs, to keep equipment flowing, to think 3 steps ahead of what the attending physician would demand. She watched the bay doors swing open and the gurney roll through, a man in his late 40s, skin pale under the oxygen mask, left shoulder already wrapped in emergency bandaging. Dr. Sterling was already there, already giving orders in that voice of his that carried the weight of someone who'd never been questioned. 2 large-bore lines. Let's get a type and cross, CBC, CMP, ABD ultrasound protocol. Get him to the scanner. His movements were assured, competent even. Rachel felt a fraction of respect attach itself to her observation, then immediately withdraw. Competence and cruelty weren't mutually exclusive. She'd learned that at age 23. The patient was gone within minutes, transferred to radiology for the scan that would rule out internal bleeding. The bay quieted. The adrenaline bled out of the air. Rachel began restocking the supplies she'd anticipated they'd use, rolled bandages, saline bags, medication trays. Her hands moved on their own, guided by pattern recognition and experience no temp nurse should possess. That's when Dr. Sterling stopped. She felt his attention lock onto her like targeting software. "Where did you train?" His voice carried the kind of casual interest that wasn't casual at all. It was interrogation dressed in conversation. Rachel didn't look up from the portrait she was organizing. "Community college. 2-year program." "Why?" "Your technique. I watched you prepare those supplies." He paused. It was meant to be a compliment that landed as a threat. "You move like someone with more background than a temp assignment usually provides." "Good training." Her voice stayed level. "Deferential." The mask fit well because she'd worn it for 3 weeks straight. "I try to anticipate the attending's needs before he has to ask." Sterling smiled. It was the smile of someone who'd just noticed a variable in an experiment that didn't belong in the control group. "See that you keep anticipating. Not overstepping." "Yes, doctor." He left. The temperature in the bay seemed to normalize, though it probably hadn't changed at all. Rachel finished organizing the supplies and moved back to the main corridor. The afternoon light had shifted, 3:51 p.m. now, and somewhere in the hospital, the admission counter was processing a new patient. She didn't know that yet. But her instincts, honed by years of reading crisis before it announced itself, sensed something shifting in the hospital's rhythm. The overhead pages continued their steady stream. Code blue in cardiac. Discharge instructions in pediatrics. "Dr. Chen, your consult is ready in the ICU." Then, at 4:15 p.m., the rhythm changed. "Incoming VIP transfer," the admission coordinator announced over the hospital intercom. "General Thomas Whitmore, incoming from St. Luke's, condition critical, ETA 12 minutes. Prepare ICU bed 7. Cardiogenic shock. All senior staff stand by." Rachel froze. The name traveled through her like current through water. General Thomas Whitmore. She heard it exactly once before, at a deployment briefing in Kandahar in 2012, when he was still Major Whitmore and she was Lieutenant Torres, or Senior Chief Torres, to be precise, though that name had been buried so deep it might as well have been dead. He'd led the raid into Jolan district that changed everything. He'd led her son's first combat operation. Her son, who'd come home with a 1,000-yard stare and a purple heart on her face whenever she looked in the mirror. Her hands stopped trembling. That was usually the first sign that something deeper was taking over. The training. The old self. The person the classified file said couldn't exist anymore. ICU bed 7 was 3 corridors north and 2 flights up. Rachel made her way there before the general's ambulance pulled under the emergency bay canopy. She watched from a distance as the transfer team wheeled him inside, a man in his 60s now, face grey as concrete, oxygen mask fogging with each labored breath. He was clutching something inside his jacket. As he passed, Rachel glimpsed it, a patch. Military insignia. Faded. Sewn into the lining of his jacket like a talisman. The Special Forces patch from Kandahar. The same insignia stitched on the memorial wall in her son's bedroom. Dr. Sterling arrived in the ICU moments after the general. The hierarchy shifted immediately. The attending physician who'd been preparing the bed stepped back. Sterling became the center of gravity, the commanding presence around which all other bodies arranged themselves. He read the transfer notes with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he understood exactly who had just arrived under his care, not just a patient, but leverage. "Acute pericardial effusion with tamponade," Sterling murmured, reading the cardiology report. "BP 70 over 50. This man has maybe 18 hours before his heart stops altogether. They couldn't decompress him at St. Luke's. Cardiologist recommended transfer for possible surgical intervention," the resident offered. "He said you had experience with complicated cardiac cases." Sterling nodded slowly, and Rachel watched something settle behind his eyes, not concern. Recognition. The kind of recognition that came with understanding that the patient in the bed had once held power, and that power was now gone. Vulnerable. Under his control. Start continuous monitoring, Sterling ordered. I want central line access, pulmonary artery catheter, and get cardiothoracic on standby. This man is not going anywhere without my approval. He paused, letting the authority settle into every corner of the room. And someone find out who his family is. If he codes without consent forms, I want documentation that we did everything protocol required. The family arrived at 6:41 p.m. A son. A daughter. Both in their 40s, both with the bearing of people accustomed to following their father's lead. They sat in the waiting area outside the ICU, hands clasped, faces tight with the specific dread that came from watching someone slip away one breath at a time. Rachel observed them from 2 rooms away, pretending to chart medications. She wasn't assigned to General Whitmore's care, that would be the ICU's full-time staff. But the hospital's rhythms were predictable, and the predictable gaps were where temp nurses worked. Where invisible people could move. The general's breathing was shallow. Each respiration fought against the fluid pressure surrounding his heart. She knew the diagnosis without hearing it confirmed. Pericardial effusion. Cardiac tamponade. The pressure was squeezing his heart, strangling its ability to pump, turning each beat into an act of will. Dr. Sterling stood at the window of the ICU bed, hands in his coat pockets, watching the monitor with the expression of a man who'd already decided on the outcome. He didn't look like someone planning to intervene. He looked like someone watching an investment decline. At 9:33 p.m., when the general's blood pressure dropped to 62/32, Rachel was restocking the trauma cart in the hallway outside the ICU. She heard Sterling's voice through the monitor system, calm and measured, explaining to the family why they should prepare themselves for the worst. His heart is under too much pressure, Sterling said. The underlying condition is too advanced. Even if we attempted decompression, his prognosis would remain poor. The family's silence was answer enough. They were deferring. Accepting. Preparing to grieve. Rachel finished restocking the cart and checked the pericardiocentesis kit one more time. Needle 18 gauge. Syringe 20 milliliters. Alcohol and betadine swabs. Everything was there. Everything was ready. The equipment was ready. The general was not ready to die, though. She could see it in his vitals, in the way his oxygen saturation was fighting to stay above 70%, in the tremor in his hand as he reached for his son. He was fighting. He was hanging on. He was not ready. The question was whether Dr. Sterling's decisions were driven by medicine or something else. And that question, Rachel knew, would define the next 72 hours in ways no one in this hospital could predict. The fluorescent lights hummed on, indifferent and eternal, above the hospital that had become her temporary refuge and the general who'd become her unexpected moral crisis. She checked the pericardiocentesis kit one final time, then moved back into invisibility. The general's room smelled like antiseptic and the faint metallic edge of fear. Rachel adjusted the morphine drip, her fingers steady on the fall line, watching the clear fluid travel down the tubing toward his vein. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, for now. The general's adult daughter sat rigid in the visitor's chair, her son standing by the window, both of them watching Rachel with the careful attention of people who didn't know what they were looking at. The door opened without a knock. Dr. Sterling entered like he owned the room, his white coat moving before he did, his eyes scanning the machinery with the kind of dismissive precision that confused authority with competence. He didn't acknowledge the family. He didn't acknowledge Rachel. He addressed the machines first, then turned to her like she was equipment that had been installed wrong. Nurse Nightingale, step away from that equipment. You're not qualified to touch it. Rachel's hands didn't stop moving. She finished her notation in the chart. One measured breath. The fluorescent lights above them buzzed, a sound like 1,000 insects trapped in a glass box. She turned to face him, her eyes steady, her voice level. The general's comfort is my priority, doctor. His morphine is holding at the current dose. Sterling smiled, and it was the kind of smile that came from knowing you had an audience. He gestured at Rachel with the kind of dismissive wave you'd use to clear cigarette smoke. Temps handle bedpans, not pain management. Do you even understand cardiac protocols, or did you skip that module at whatever staffing agency sent you? He turned to the general's daughter, his tone shifting into something softer, more reasonable. Your father is a war hero. He deserves actual medical professionals, not, well. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The daughter's face tightened. The son looked away. Rachel felt the weight of their judgment land like a physical thing, but she didn't flinch. Flinching was what people expected. She simply met Sterling's gaze and held it, her voice dropping into a register that was quieter but somehow heavier. The general's vitals are stable. His medication is appropriate. His comfort level is documented. Your priority, Sterling said, his voice carrying down the hallway now, loud enough that passing staff could hear every syllable, is following MY orders. This man served his country with distinction. He deserves actual care, not whatever obsessive nonsense you think you're providing. Rachel closed the chart. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply excused herself from the room with the kind of quiet that made the space feel smaller when she left it. But that wasn't the worst part. 40 minutes later, Rachel passed the unit bulletin board near the nurse's station. Sterling had posted a formal write-up in the yellow envelope reserved for disciplinary documentation. Her name. Her infraction. Written in the careful language of institutional accusation, inappropriate emotional attachment to patients. Overstepping scope of practice. Unsafe independent judgment. The words sat there like accusations, and they were printed large enough that anyone walking by would read them. Anyone who wanted to know why Rachel Torres couldn't be trusted. The break room at shift change was where the verdict got delivered. Rachel sat at the long table with a container of chicken and rice, something simple, something that wouldn't betray her hands if they decided to shake. Sarah Chen came in first, took one look at Rachel, and stood up. Not slowly. Not with hesitation. She stood up and left, taking her coffee with her. Miguel followed 5 minutes later. Then the day shift, one by one, until the chairs around the table were empty except for the one Rachel occupied. She wasn't naive about loyalty. Loyalty was a currency, and Sterling had better credit. Sterling could fire people, could write their evaluations, could make the difference between a good reference and a phone call that ended careers. Rachel was a temp. A temp with a write-up already on the board. She took a bite of chicken that tasted like nothing. The break room hummed with the vending machine's electrical drone. Outside the window, Houston's afternoon heat shimmered off the parking lot like a mirage. And then a tear escaped. Just one. Not from fear. Not from humiliation. Rachel had survived things that would have broken most people into pieces. She'd held soldiers while they died. She'd made decisions that cost lives, and decisions that saved them. A hospital gossip chain and a write-up were not the things that made her cry. But this tear came from something else entirely. It came from the knowledge that the general was in that room with tamponade developing, that his vitals were trending in the wrong direction, that Sterling had already decided Rachel wasn't worth listening to, and that protocol, the beautiful, impersonal protocol that was supposed to protect patients, would grind forward exactly as slowly as Sterling wanted it to. She wiped the tear away without looking down. Dr. Sterling stood in the break room doorway. He'd been waiting. He'd staged this moment the way he staged everything, with an audience that would talk, with words that would travel. He was watching her, his expression carrying the satisfaction of a man who had just crushed something that tried to stand up to him. Rachel met his eyes. No apology in her face. No shame. No breaking. Just a woman sitting at a table, her voice coming out steady and low and carrying the weight of 18 years in places Sterling would never see, wars Sterling would never fight, decisions Sterling would never have to make. My record will speak louder than your insecurity, doctor. The break room went dead silent. The vending machine's hum seemed to get louder, like the universe was trying to fill the space where sound should have been. Sterling's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that. He wasn't used to people who weren't afraid of him, who didn't need him, who understood that a write-up in a yellow envelope was nothing compared to the weight of classified operations and impossible choices made at 3 in the morning under fire. He smiled, but it wasn't the same smile. This one had an edge to it, the kind of expression you saw on a man who'd been disrespected in public and was already calculating how to respond. "We'll see what your record says when I'm done with it," he said, and walked out. The fluorescent lights continued their insect drone above her head. Rachel finished her chicken. The general's monitor was still beeping down the hallway, steady for now, steady for this moment. But Sterling was already moving, already making calls. She could feel it, the way you could feel a storm building before the first wind reached you. She needed to get back to that room. She needed to monitor those vitals. She needed to be ready for what was coming. But first, she reached down to her scrub pocket where the faded unit patch lived, sewn inside the lining of a jacket she couldn't wear in a hospital, a piece of textile history that proved she'd been somewhere, done something, earned something that no write-up could erase. Her fingers found it in the darkness of the pocket. The cloth was soft from 18 years of carrying weight it was never supposed to carry. The patch itself had survived briefing rooms and desert drops and moments when soldiers believed they were about to die. It had survived better than most of the men who'd earned it. Rachel let her hand rest there, the way another person might hold a rosary or a photograph. Then she stood, put her container in the trash, and walked back toward the general's room where the real work was about to begin. What she didn't know was that Dr. Sterling was already on his phone in his office, his contact list pulled up, his finger hovering over Board Chairman Morrison's home number. What she didn't know was that Sterling was building something, a narrative, a case, a professional destruction, the same way he built everything. Carefully. Methodically. With the kind of patience that came from knowing the system would protect him. The next 48 hours would require every skill Rachel had ever learned. The cardiac monitor's alarm split the silence like artillery fire. 2 a.m. The ICU's fluorescent glow had turned the general's skin translucent, waxy. Rachel was at the nurse's station, charting vitals, when the first beep became a scream, a high-pitched wail that meant the heart rate was climbing past normal into the red zone. 142, 156. 168, not a rhythm. A warning. She moved before thought caught up with her. Boots on tile. The sound was distinctive, combat boots issued 14 years ago, never officially decommissioned, never officially anything. She reached the general's room in 8 seconds flat. Distance measured in heartbeats. The scene inside was already deteriorating. The general's chest rose in shallow gasps. His eyes were half open, unfocused, rolling slightly backward. His neck veins were distended, standing out like rope under his skin. Not normal. Not even close to normal. His breathing was rapid, shallow, the pattern of a man whose lungs were being crushed from the inside. Rachel's hand moved to the cardiac monitor. Blood pressure reading 62/38. It was already dropping when she arrived. Within seconds, 46/32. The systolic pressure was falling like a stone down a well with no bottom. Beck's triad. She didn't say it aloud. She knew it without saying it. Distended neck veins. Muffled heart sounds, she could barely hear them even with the stethoscope pressed directly to his chest, as if his heart was beating inside a pillowcase underwater. Hypertension. Dropping fast. Classic cardiac tamponade. The pericardial sac, the membrane surrounding his heart, was filling with fluid. Not blood from the heart itself. Fluid. Accumulating. Pressing. Crushing. The general's body was being suffocated from the inside. Rachel hit the code button on the wall. Not because she expected help to arrive in time. Because protocol demanded it. Because documentation mattered. Because she had learned in Kandahar under fire that you followed procedure even when procedure was going to fail you. Then she moved. She didn't wait for Sterling. She didn't call for orders. She didn't hesitate for the fraction of a second it would have taken for doubt to enter her body. Her hands were already moving, grabbing the crash cart, finding the pericardiocentesis kit. 18-gauge needle. Ultrasound probe. Chlorhexidine for the skin. The movements were automatic because they weren't automatic at all. They were muscle memory forged under conditions that would have broken most people's minds. Kandahar. Forward operating base shank. 2011, a medevac had come in with a trauma surgeon who was actively bleeding out, shrapnel from an IED lodged 3 mm from his cardiac sac. She had performed the same procedure on him with only a handheld ultrasound that kept losing signal because the power generator was unreliable. She had kept him alive for 43 minutes until the surgical team arrived. She had done it with insurgents returning fire outside the wire. She could do this in climate-controlled silence with nobody shooting at her. The general's blood pressure was now 48/28. His lips were taking on a faint blue tinge. Cyanosis. The oxygen saturation monitor showed 84%. Critical. His pupils were dilating, blood being shunted away from the non-essential tissues, his body making the calculus that the brain and heart were the only organs that mattered now. Rachel prepped the subcostal approach. The needle would go in just below his xiphoid process, the small bone structure at the bottom of the sternum. She swabbed the skin with chlorhexidine in 2 concentric circles, the motions precise as a surgeon marking tissue before incision. Her hands were perfectly steady. All the tremors that had plagued her mornings, all the small shakes that came from 18 years of carrying secrets, they were gone. This was what clarity felt like. This was the absence of doubt. The ultrasound showed the pericardial sac distended like a balloon, dark fluid surrounding the heart muscle. Too much pressure. The chambers couldn't fill properly. The heart couldn't do anything but struggle and fail. She angled the needle. Advanced it slowly, watching the ultrasound image, feeling the resistance change as the needle navigated through tissue layers. Skin. Fascia. The pericardial membrane. And then, the subtle give as the tip entered the sac. She withdrew the plunger gently, creating negative pressure. For one impossible moment, nothing. Then blood. Dark, almost black, filling the syringe. She withdrew 15 milliliters. Then 25. Then 40. The pressure was changing in the chamber. She could feel it through her hands, through the needle, the same way she could feel when a rope was about to snap or when a deck was about to collapse under weight. The cardiac monitor beat differently now. The rhythm was still there. Still fast, but the desperate edge was gone. His blood pressure climbed. 50/30. 65/40. 72/48. 84/56. The numbers ascending like a staircase back from the edge of death. The pericardiocentesis catheter was positioned now, small drainage tube threaded into the sac to prevent immediate reaccumulation. She secured it with tape. 2 sutures on either side. Standard protocol. Precise movements. The kind of efficiency that came from having done this under mortar fire. The code team arrived 2 minutes later. For people in scrubs, crashing through the door with the defibrillator cart and the 4 pumps and the kind of controlled chaos that came from training. They stopped when they saw what Rachel had already completed. The catheter in place. The fluid drained. The general's blood pressure in the low normal range now, his oxygen saturation climbing back toward 92%. His pupils were starting to constrict, normal pupil responses returning as blood flow to the brain normalized. The team leader, a resident Rachel didn't recognize, looked at the equipment scattered on the bedside table. The needle. The syringe with 40 milliliters of pericardial fluid. The catheter secured to his chest. Who did the tap? His voice was young. Confused. As if the question itself didn't compute. Rachel was already disposing of the needle in the sharps container. 2-minute presentation. Distended neck veins, muffled heart sounds, hypertension. Classic presentation. Couldn't wait for authorization. The resident's face went white. You performed an invasive. He was dying. Rachel cut him off with the tone of someone stating simple fact. Not argument. Not defense. Just information. 2-minute window. Procedure worked. He's stable. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Sterling was standing in the doorway. Rachel had sensed him arrive without looking. She had learned to track people the way predators track movement in tall grass. His face was empty for exactly 2 seconds. Blank as a slate. Then the anger came rushing in like a tide, flooding his features from hairline to jaw. You performed an invasive procedure without attending physician authorization. His voice was low. Controlled. Which meant the rage was so total it had cycled back into something cold. You performed a procedure that carries a 1 to 2% mortality risk without written consent. You? Blood pressure was 48/28. Rachel turned to face him. Her eyes were flat. The color of winter water. Sinus rhythm was 168. Oxygen saturation 84%. Pericardial sac distended with approximately 150 milliliters of fluid. Beck's triad was textbook. Would you like me to repeat the procedure step by step, or does the patient's continued breathing provide adequate documentation? The code team had gone completely still. The kind of silence that comes right before something breaks. Sterling's jaw clenched. Once. Twice. Security will escort you from the building at shift change. You're done. Your employment at Mercy General ends immediately. Terminated for cause. For willfully violating protocol and performing unauthorized procedures that endangered patient safety. Rachel removed her employee badge from around her neck. She set it on the bedside table next to the pericardiocentesis kit. The badge caught the overhead light for a moment before settling. Flat. Finished. Understood, doctor. She turned and walked out of the room. Not running. Not hurrying. Just walking, the same way she had walked out of FOB Shank when her tour was complete, the same way she had walked out of every classified operation, leaving no evidence, no record, just the ghost of her presence and nothing more. Her hands were perfectly steady as she reached the locker room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in a jar. She had saved the general's life. She had done it with the precision of someone who had held hands while watching blood pressure drop. She had done it with the hands of someone who had nothing left to lose. And now she had nothing left to have either. At 5:24 a.m., Dr. Sterling sat in his office at Mercy General with the hospital still dark around him, his fingers poised over his phone like a general positioning troops on a battlefield. Chairman Morrison would be awake. Men like Morrison were always awake, their minds didn't permit sleep when leverage was involved. Sterling dialed. The connection came through clean. Morrison. It's Sterling. No greeting. No preamble. We have a termination situation that requires immediate board authorization. The voice on the other end carried the weight of someone accustomed to making decisions that erased people from institutional memory. Go ahead. The temp nurse on my cardiac ward, Torres, performed an unauthorized pericardiocentesis on General Whitmore at 2 a.m. without attending physician approval. 40 milliliters of fluid extracted. Needle went in blind. She could have perforated his myocardium. Could have killed him. Sterling let that hang. Liability exposure is catastrophic. We're talking 8 figures if something had gone wrong. We need termination completed before 8 a.m. and her file flagged across every hospital system in Texas. Morrison's breathing changed. Just slightly. That was the sound of a man calculating exposure. Credentials? That's the interesting part, Sterling said, and he smiled into the darkness. Her references are spotty. I've got Investigator Chen pulling her background now. Early indicators suggest credential falsification. Missing documentation from her prior employment. Gaps in employment history. The kind of person who migrates between systems precisely because she can't get licensed. It was beautiful, the way lies worked when you planted them correctly. You didn't have to make people disbelieve the truth, you just had to introduce doubt. Doubt was a seed. Doubt grew. I want her gone before shift change, Morrison said. And I want legal to review everything before HR processes anything. Don't give her a chance to claim retaliation. Already on it, Sterling said. I'm having Chen prepare a comprehensive report documenting unsafe practice, credential concerns, and emotional instability. Torres showed obsessive behavior toward the patient. Inappropriate attachment. That goes in the file as the termination reason. Keeps us protected. The word obsessive was calculated. It suggested mental illness. It suggested danger. It suggested that any defense Rachel Torres might mount would be the delusions of an unstable person. Sterling hung up and immediately called Investigator Chen, who answered on the second ring, the kind of answer that told Sterling the man was already awake, already working, already part of the network. These men existed in Sterling's orbit like satellites, rotating around his influence, bound by favors owed and advancement promised. Chen. I need a comprehensive background audit on Rachel Torres, temp nursing staff, completed by 7 a.m. The official reason is credential verification. The actual reason is I need documented evidence of credential falsification, employment gaps, mental health concerns, anything that makes her look unstable. I've already flagged her with Morrison. We're terminating at 8 a.m. sharp. I need your report to make it airtight. What am I looking for specifically? Chen's voice carried the clinical detachment of someone who had done this before. She performed a procedure without authorization. We're calling it unsafe practice combined with credential concerns. We need the report to establish a pattern of instability. Prior employers. Background checks. Anything that shows inconsistency, gaps, or signs of psychiatric intervention. You understand the assignment. Chen understood. Men like Chen always did. They built the scaffolding that allowed men like Sterling to demolish people without getting their hands dirty. I'll have it to you by 6:45. Sterling hung up and began drafting the formal documentation himself, a meticulous record of the pericardiocentesis performed without authorization, the liability exposure, the safety protocol violation. He was building a case that would survive legal review, that would survive inquiry, that would transform a woman who had just saved a man's life into a threat that needed to be neutralized. By 7:30 a.m., the file was complete. By 7:45 a.m., Morrison had approved the termination. By 8:02 a.m., Rachel Torres was being escorted to the administrative office, where HR Director Patricia Owens handed her a termination letter with the efficiency of someone processing routine paperwork rather than ending a career. The letter cited unsafe practice, credential concerns, emotional instability, and violation of protocol. It was designed to ensure Rachel Torres could never claim wrongful termination, because the file, once reviewed, would make the hospital look cautious rather than cruel. They were protecting patients. They were following procedure. They were doing exactly what institutions do when they decide someone is expendable. Security walked her to her locker. The hallway felt different now, the same corridor she had walked through for 3 months suddenly transformed into enemy territory. Nurses who had trained her looked away. The respiratory therapist who had worked beside her during dozens of crises pretended to study a chart. The acceptance that had never really been there evaporated completely, revealing its true nature, conditional approval, always one mistake away from exile. Rachel entered her locker without speaking. A photo of her son in his dress uniform. A few personal items. A sealed envelope she had never opened, her son's letter to her from Kandahar, the one he'd written before his patrol into Sanjan Valley when he was 19 years old and believed he might not come home. She kept it sealed. Some things were more powerful when you didn't know what they said. Security watched her leave. No one said goodbye. No one thanked her for saving a general's life. Within 3 days, there would be a new temp nurse in her position, and within a week, no one would remember her name. The VA hospital waiting room was a different kind of silence, the silence of men carrying invisible wounds, of veterans who had learned to sit with their own ghosts. Rachel sat in the waiting area 2 days later with her hands trembling in her lap, waiting for a psychiatrist who might explain why her service-related tremors had intensified so dramatically that she could barely hold a coffee cup. The paperwork she'd filled out said civilian patient. It said her occupation was healthcare worker. It did not say senior chief petty officer. It did not say she had served in special forces. It did not say she had saved lives under Taliban fire. Around her sat men she had treated in combat zones. A Marine with a prosthetic arm sat 3 chairs away, his face scarred from an IED blast in Fallujah. An Army Ranger with PTSD sat near the water fountain, his leg bouncing with the constant kinetic anxiety of someone whose nervous system had been rewired by explosions. A Navy corpsman with a burn scar running from his neck to his collarbone waited for his appointment. These were her people. These were the ones she had held together when everything was falling apart. And she was invisible to them. Just another patient. Just another veteran sitting in the waiting room. The thing about being erased from official records was that it made you erased from everything else too. There was no certificate that said Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres. There was no documentation of 4,847 lives saved. There was no public record of the Kandahar operation that had cost her son his left leg and cost her everything she had been. She had walked into Mercy General as a temp nurse with questionable credentials, and she was walking out the same way, a ghost moving through the world, untethered from anything official, untethered from proof of her own existence. The waiting room clock read 2:14 p.m. In his ICU bed at Mercy General, General Thomas Whitmore lay with a faded unit patch clutched in his hand, a Special Forces insignia sewn into the lining of his jacket, the same patch Rachel had worn on her uniform in the same valley where everything had changed. His heart was stable now. His blood pressure had normalized. The fluid that had been crushing his cardiac function had been drained by hands that had performed the same procedure in field hospitals built from rubble and desperation. He had not opened his eyes yet. The doctors said he would, eventually. The doctors said his prognosis was excellent. But General Whitmore knew something the doctors didn't. He knew that the person who saved his life was the same person who had been erased, the same person whose name he could not speak because it had been classified out of existence, the same person who had stopped a war crime and been buried alive by the institution that created her. Commander Hayes was en route from Naval Base San Diego, receiving his briefing from Dr. Sterling, who explained with professional concern that the temp nurse had shown signs of instability, that her credentials were questionable, that the hospital had been forced to terminate her for the safety of all patients. Sterling smiled while he said it. The smile was the kind that said he believed every word. The smile was the kind that made people trust you, right up until the moment you destroyed them. Rachel was clearing out her locker when the hospital doors exploded open like gunfire. Her son Marco stood in the lobby, his face fierce with purpose, carrying something she had forbidden him to touch for 6 years. The shadow box. The medals. His boots clicked against the tile floor as he walked toward the main desk, and every person in that hospital who had turned their back on her stopped moving. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. 16 years old and already standing like a soldier, Marco held that shadow box in front of him like evidence at trial. The fluorescent lights caught the glass, caught the gleam of ribbon she had buried in a closet, ribbon she had hoped would stay buried forever. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres," Marco said. The room went dead silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from shock. The kind that comes from truth hitting like a defibrillator. The kind that makes the air pressure change. Rachel stood frozen at her locker, her hand still on the empty hook where her badge had hung 24 hours ago. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just watched her son, the boy she had raised alone, the boy who had watched her scrub other people's wounds while hiding her own, finally break the silence that had defined both their lives. Patricia, the charge nurse, was the first one to move. She walked to the desk, her hands trembling, and picked up Rachel's personnel file. The one marked terminated for cause. The one that had been the death certificate for her career at Mercy General. Patricia's voice cracked as she opened the file. Bronze Star. 2003, Kandahar, Valor under fire during a classified operation. She looked up, tears streaming. Silver Star. 2007, direct medical intervention under enemy engagement that resulted in saving the lives of 4 Special Forces operatives. Patricia's hand shook as she turned the page. Purple Heart. Twice. Shrapnel from an IED. Bullet wound to the left shoulder. Her voice broke entirely. Navy Commendation Medal. Humanitarian Service Medal. Combat Medical Badge with 2 oak leaf clusters. The staff that had abandoned Rachel in the break room stood frozen. The doctors who had avoided her. The administrators who had signed off on Sterling's accusations. They stood watching Patricia read a classified military record that wasn't supposed to exist, that had been officially erased from every database when Rachel was pulled from active duty and inserted into civilian life as a ghost. The elevator doors opened at 2:48 p.m. on that Tuesday, and Commander James Hayes walked out in dress blues. Gold shoulder boards catching light like authority itself had arrived. He moved through the lobby with the kind of quiet precision that comes from having led men through fire, and every person still standing there instinctively stepped back. His eyes found Rachel. "Senior Chief Torres," he said. It wasn't a greeting. It was a salute delivered through words. "I came to collect one of my best." Commander Hayes turned to face the assembled staff, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 6,000 miles and 8 years of classified operations. "Bronze Star," he said, his words measured like a ritual. The commander's jaw clenched. "Silver Star." He paused, and his eyes moved to Rachel. 2 Purple Hearts. His voice cracked on the next one. "Navy Cross." He knelt before her. 30-year career Navy officer, commander of SEAL Team 3, knelt on the floor of Mercy General Houston in front of a woman they had called just a nurse, just a temp, just someone overstepping her bounds. "You saved my entire platoon," he said. "They told us you died in that canyon. They told us the medic we were looking for never made it out. They told us to forget you existed." Rachel's hand found his shoulder as he knelt, and for the first time since she had been terminated, her composure didn't just hold. It transformed. The trembling thing they had misread as fear showed itself for what it actually was, the restraint of a woman who had been carrying an entire life underground. The FBI agents entered through the south entrance at 3:12 p.m. 2 of them, moving with the efficient precision of federal authority. They walked directly to the nurse's station where Dr. Sterling was reviewing charts, still convinced his network was holding. "Dr. Marcus Sterling," the agent said. Her name was Park. Her voice was the kind that had ended careers before. "You accessed classified military personnel records without authorization on 7 separate occasions. You contacted the Naval Criminal Investigative Service under false pretenses, claiming to be conducting a hospital security review. You requested sealed service files for Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres. You then attempted to alter her service number entries in the NCIS database to discredit her professional history." Sterling's face drained of color. His hands went to his pockets, a gesture that looked like fear finally cracking through 15 years of arrogance. "I was conducting due diligence," he stammered. She had no verifiable background. The credentials were criminal negligence, Agent Park said. "Not a question. A statement of fact. You restricted cardiac monitoring protocols on General Thomas Whitmore knowing he was at high risk for recurrent pericardial effusion. That restriction forced Senior Chief Torres to perform an emergency pericardiocentesis without authorization. Not because she overstepped. Because you made it impossible for her not to." Board Chairman Morrison stepped out of the elevator, his face grim as a headstone. He looked at Sterling the way you look at something broken beyond repair. "Marcus, your privileges are suspended effective immediately. The board has been briefed. You're done here." External investigator Chen approached from the administrative wing, her audit report gripped in both hands like evidence that mattered. "Dr. Sterling, my review confirms you falsified incident reports, backdated complaints, and contacted professional references with false allegations of mental instability. That's fraud. Potentially criminal fraud. The handcuffs went on quietly. Sterling didn't resist. He just stood there while a federal officer read him his rights, the words washing over him like water over a stone that had finally realized it was drowning. The staff watched as he was led through the lobby. Past Marco, who stood absolutely still, holding that shadow box. Past Patricia, who had already torn the write-up board down from the unit wall, the one that still bore Sterling's accusations in black marker, inappropriate emotional attachment to patients. Overstepping scope of practice. The handcuffs caught the light as Sterling was escorted through the automatic doors. The perp walk didn't have to be long. The lobby had seen everything. Everyone in Mercy General had just watched a man's career end in approximately 4 minutes. By 5 p.m., his medical license was suspended pending formal revocation. Within 6 weeks, Sterling was selling insurance from a folding table at a strip mall off Highway 59, cold calling people from a phone list, surviving on commission splits and the knowledge that he had tried to bury a warrior and had instead buried himself. Commander Hayes brought Rachel to the ICU at 7:41 p.m. The general had been moved there from his earlier room, stabilized but still fragile, his heart held together by medications and the knowledge that the woman who saved his life was no longer invisible. "He's been asking for you," Commander Hayes said as they walked the corridor. He remembered. All through the delirium, he kept asking for the medic from Kandahar. "We told him she was gone." He didn't believe us. Rachel's dress uniform hung on her frame like something she was wearing for the first time. The one Commander Hayes had brought from the Federal Records Facility in Arlington. 6 years since she'd worn it. The ribbons gleamed under the lights, medals of valor, recognition, service rendered in the dark so that other people could live in the light. Marco stood beside her as she entered the ICU room. The general's eyes opened when he saw her. They widened, and for a moment he just stared, as if the woman walking through his door was the final piece of a puzzle he had been assembling in his unconscious mind for 2 days. She raised her hand in salute. He raised his, weak, trembling, but present, and returned it. "At ease, Senior Chief," he whispered. "You saved me twice," the general said. His voice was barely sound, just breath shaped into words. "Once in Kandahar when I was a colonel and you stopped that war crime. And now. You pulled me back from nothing." His eyes moved to the bedside table, where the faded unit patch had been framed. The patch sewn inside jacket lining that had survived 6 years underground, that held the proof she had always existed. "I kept this to remember you," the general said. "They told me you never existed. That you were erased. But I remembered your hands. I remembered you talking me through the pain so I wouldn't panic. I remembered you saying pain is data, data is survival, and we were going to survive." Rachel's voice was steady and commanding now, the voice of a senior chief petty officer addressing a general who finally understood her rank. "I existed, sir. I still do." The general's daughter was crying. The hospital CEO was crying. Marco was standing at attention, finally understanding the weight his mother had carried, why her hands were steady when everyone else's shook, why she had chosen to heal when she could have chosen anything else. "You didn't just save my life," the general said. "You saved something bigger. You kept faith when everything told you to walk away." Rachel nodded slowly. In the parking lot, later, Marco asked her what happened now. She looked at her son, at the shadow box he was still holding, at the hospital entrance where she had been erased and then revealed in the span of 4 hours. True class is what you do when the lights go out. She had done it bleeding in Kandahar. She had done it walking invisible through Mercy General. She had done it knowing she would never be thanked, never be recognized, never be anything but the quiet hand that held people together. Now the lights were on. "We serve, Marco," she said. "That's what we do. We serve because service is the only thing bigger than ourselves." She walked back into Mercy General at 8:15 p.m., through the front entrance, her head high, her uniform crisp, her identity finally speaking louder than anyone's fear. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been invisible despite everything you've given, Rachel's story is for you. Subscribe for more stories of warriors who refuse to disappear. Like this video, comment with your own stories of hidden strength, and share this with anyone who needs to know that true heroism doesn't need applause to be real.